Ladies and gentlemen, there comes a point in every connection where doubt starts to whisper, where you start questioning your worth because someone made you feel like your love was a burden, your presence was too loud, your standards too high. But what if the truth isn't that you were asking for too much? What if the truth is you were giving too much to someone who never deserved that level of access to your heart in the first place? Tonight, we're not here to talk about being too much. We're here to talk about what happens when you finally realize who was never enough for you. There's a certain kind of power that comes with silence, a kind that can't be found in raised voices or long explanations. Silence has weight. It carries with it everything that words often fail to say. While people scramble to defend, to justify, to argue, the one who chooses silence often holds the greatest strength, not because they have nothing to say, but because they've said enough. Because they've realized that being heard doesn't always come from volume, but from value, and silence becomes the most valuable thing they can offer. When someone goes silent, it unsettles the room, it creates tension. It invites reflection. You begin to wonder what they're thinking, why they're holding back, and whether their silence is emptiness or meaning. And most of the time, it's not empty at all. It's full. It's full of things that were never acknowledged. Full of things they screamed quietly through their consistency, their care, their patience, and still it wasn't noticed. So instead of repeating themselves, they choose silence, not to manipulate, but to preserve. Not to punish, but to protect. There's nothing passive about silence when it's intentional. It's a boundary. It's the final message. It's what remains when energy has been drained, when conversations have gone in circles, and when emotional effort has become one-sided. Silence becomes the only thing left when trying has felt like begging, and while it may confuse the person on the other end, it's often the clearest form of communication. I've done all I could. The rest is no longer mine to carry. The beauty of silence is that it invites the other person to step into their own accountability. In the absence of your words, they are forced to listen to themselves, to their tone, to their patterns, to the way they've responded or failed to respond. When you stop speaking, they begin hearing everything you used to say. They begin to feel the lack of effort they once dismissed. The warmth they used to feel from you no longer wraps around them. The emotional safety you once provided disappears, and now in the quiet they hear their own echoes more than ever before. Sometimes silence says, I won't argue for my worth anymore. Sometimes it says, I gave you space to meet me halfway, you stayed still. And sometimes it says nothing at all, because the person it's directed toward already knows. They know what they did, they know what they didn't do, they know they ignored, delayed, dismissed, or devalued, and they hope that by staying silent back, they can reset the story. But it doesn't work like that. Silence doesn't erase memories, it reveals them. It's not that the person who goes silent has no feelings, quite the opposite. They feel deeply, so deeply that continuing to speak would only drain them more. So instead, they choose stillness, they choose self-respect. They choose to stop explaining their emotions to someone who refuses to handle them with care. And in doing so, they often speak louder than they ever did with words. The one who stays silent after giving you every chance to understand them is not being cold, they're being clear. Silence is clarity. It says, this is what it feels like when I stop filling the space between us. This is what it feels like when my effort is no longer there to bridge the gap. And for many, that silence is the wake-up call. It's the moment they realize how much presence was hidden in all that communication, how much love was laced in every call, every text, every gesture, and now, with nothing left but quiet, they hear it all at once. It's easy to overlook someone when they're always explaining, when they're always forgiving, when they're always available, but once that silence arrives, you start to remember every word they once said. You start to feel the absence of what you once dismissed, and it stings, not because of what they are doing, but because of what you didn't do when you had the chance. That's why silence is so loud, not because it shouts, but because it holds the echo of everything that went unappreciated. It's the final chapter written with invisible ink, the moment where actions matter more than apologies, where presence matters more than promises, and where nothing, ironically, says everything. Regret doesn't always show up in the moment. It waits, it lingers quietly in the background, unnoticed, until the absence of someone becomes impossible to ignore. It doesn't crash in like a storm, it creeps in like a shadow, inching closer with every silent day, every missed call, every moment that used to be filled by a voice, a glance, a heartbeat, and suddenly something that once felt normal, familiar, even, feels like a gaping space no one else can fill. It's strange how presence is taken for granted when it's consistent. When someone shows up for you day after day, checks in, listens, laughs at your jokes, remembers the little things, you get used to it. You start believing that they'll always be there, like air or gravity. You forget that their presence is a choice, not a guarantee. And when that presence quietly fades, regret slowly takes its place. Because you don't just miss them, you begin to feel the loss of every moment you didn't fully appreciate when they were still within reach. Regret doesn't start big, it begins with small things. You go to send a message and realize they're no longer the first name that comes to mind. You share a joke with someone else, but it doesn't land the same way. You remember how easy it used to be with them, how natural the connection felt, how safe, and suddenly you feel the absence of what they used to bring to your world. You replay conversations, you rethink your reactions, you wonder how many times they were hurting and you didn't notice, how many times they were reaching for you emotionally while you were distracted, defensive, or distant. You try to justify your behavior. Maybe you were busy, maybe you didn't know what they needed, maybe you weren't ready to give them what they were asking for, but the truth is it wasn't always about perfection, it was about presence. They didn't need you to be perfect, they needed you to be present, to care, to try, to show up with a kind of emotional effort that says, I value you now, not just when it's convenient or when I feel like it. And now you're left remembering moments where they tried to communicate their needs, their boundaries, their desires, and you minimized it, or brushed it off, or promised to do better and never followed through. That's the part that stings, not just that they left, but that they waited for you to notice, and you didn't. You think back to the consistency they offered, the good morning messages, the late night calls, the way they remembered your appointments, your moods, your rhythms. You realize their presence wasn't just physical, it was emotional, mental, energetic, and now there's silence, not because they wanted to disappear, but because they realized their presence was being overlooked, maybe even undervalued. And that silence, it feels louder than any argument. It feels permanent in a way you didn't expect. There's a heaviness that comes when you look back and recognize how much love you were receiving while you were focused on your doubts, your fears, your distractions. How they were trying to build with you while you were still half in. You start seeing things differently. The moments that once annoyed you now make you nostalgic. The quirks you teased them about become the things you miss. The way they made you feel safe now feels like a distant warmth you can't recreate. Regret grows every time you realize they're not coming back, not out of spite, but out of self-respect. They gave you their presence. They gave you consistency, care, effort, and when you couldn't meet them there, they learned to give those things to themselves, and now you're the one left wondering. You're the one rereading old messages, watching old videos, hoping for a sign that maybe they're thinking of you too. But the hardest part about regret is knowing it could have been different. It wasn't timing, it wasn't distance, it wasn't fate, it was you being emotionally absent while they were standing right in front of you. And now that they're gone, you understand that presence isn't something you ask for when you're ready. It's something you honor when it's offered. And by the time you realize that, all you're left with is the echo of what was, and the heavy silence of what will never be again. There's a moment, often quiet and personal, where you sit back and ask yourself, was I really asking for too much? You replay conversations in your mind, the looks, the sighs, the way they made you feel like your needs were excessive, your boundaries were inconvenient, and your standards were unrealistic. You remember shrinking parts of yourself just to keep the peace, biting your tongue so they wouldn't feel uncomfortable, accepting breadcrumbs and telling yourself it was a meal just to keep the connection alive. But the more you think about it, the clearer it becomes. It wasn't that you were asking for too much. It's that you were giving far too much to someone who wasn't ready, willing, or capable of receiving it. You see, it's not too much to want consistency. It's not too much to want someone who shows up, not only when it's easy, but especially when it's hard. It's not too much to want to feel emotionally safe, to have honest communication, to be chosen daily without having to beg for it. You weren't demanding royalty treatment. You were just hoping that your emotional investment would be met with something that felt reciprocal. But every time you brought it up, they made it seem like you were the problem, like you were high maintenance, too intense, too sensitive. They'd sigh, look away, or hit you with vague words like you're just being dramatic, or I can't deal with this right now. And over time, those words started to stick. So you adjusted, you lowered your voice, you compromised your needs, you told yourself to be more understanding, to be more patient. But in reality, you were slowly abandoning yourself to stay connected to someone who was never really offering you a full version of themselves. You gave love like it was oxygen, hoping they'd learn to breathe it in and finally reciprocate. But they didn't, because they were never trying to meet you halfway. They were just hoping you'd keep doing all the emotional work for both of you. You gave your time, your energy, your forgiveness, your second chances over and over again. You explained your feelings not once, but a dozen times, hoping this would be the time they actually listened. You made excuses for their behavior. You convinced yourself they cared deep down, even when their actions said otherwise. You made room for them in your life, but they never made room for you in theirs. And when you finally hit your emotional limit, when you said, I can't keep doing this, they made you feel guilty for being exhausted. But what they never saw was the effort behind the scenes, the nights you cried in silence, the times you defended them to your friends, the emotional labor you carried without ever asking them to match it. The way you showed up even when they didn't. You weren't asking for too much. You were pouring from a place of abundance into a cup that had holes in the bottom. No matter how much you gave, it was never going to be enough, not because you weren't enough, but because they were never willing to hold it with care. You weren't difficult, you were dedicated, you weren't clingy. You were committed, you weren't needy, you were nurturing, but you were giving all of that to someone who mistook love for convenience, who only appreciated your presence when they feared your absence. And now, looking back, you realize that love shouldn't feel like negotiation. It shouldn't feel like emotional survival. It should feel like partnership, like home, like something steady in a world that already offers enough chaos. The truth is, you were never too much. You were just too much for someone who didn't value depth, who couldn't recognize emotional generosity when it was right in front of them. And one day, they'll look back and realize they had something real, something rare, and they let it go because they were too emotionally immature to meet it where it stood. And by then, you'll already be giving that same love, but this time to someone who sees it, holds it, and gives it back. If you've ever been made to feel like your love was too heavy, your emotions too loud, your standards too high, let this be your reminder. The right person will never be overwhelmed by the very things that make you whole. You were never the problem. You were the presence, the peace, the effort, the heart. You didn't ask for too much. You simply offered everything to someone who never intended to rise to meet it. But that chapter is over now. And moving forward, your love doesn't need to shrink. It needs to be seen, honored, and matched, fully, freely, and finally, by someone ready to hold it with both hands.